I'm going to read a passage from Proverbs chapter 30 which talk about four little creatures that are exceedingly wise because of what they can do. It says in verse 24, "There be four things which are little upon the earth, but they are exceeding wise. The ants are a people not strong, yet they prepare their meat in the summer. The conies are but a feeble folk, yet make their houses in the rocks. The locusts have no king, yet they go forth all of them by bands. And the spider taketh hold with her hands, and is in kings' palaces." These are four creatures that are exceeding wise because of what they can do. And it's not a stretch to say that nouns are a lot like these four things. In this chapter, or in this summary video, we're going to talk about the four main uses of nouns and what we call them and how we can identify them in the Greek language. So there are four basic uses when it comes to nouns, and we'll see that there's overlap between the English and Greek languages. The subject. A word can function like the subject. Usually it's the main theme or the main idea of a sentence. A word can also be possessive, describing to whom or to what something belongs. An indirect object, to whom or for whom is the action being done. And the direct object, what is the direct recipient of the action, what's being given or what's being done. In a sentence like Greg gave me his notebook, Greg would be the subject. And in Greek, the subject is called the nominative, or the nominative case. His would be possessive, and this is the case of the genitive. He gave me his notebook. Me is functioning in this sentence like the indirect object, and the indirect object in Greek is going to be called the dative case. And the notebook. The notebook is what he gave me, and so this would be the direct object. It's receiving the action, gave me his notebook. In Greek, this kind of word is called the accusative. The key to identifying nouns in the Greek language will be the case endings or the noun endings. If we look at our example, Greg gave me his notebook, we can see that the form of a word has to do with the use. For instance, it would not be correct to say, Greg gave I his notebook. That's because I, though it refers to the same person as me, is not appearing in the correct case. The way a word is written has to do with its usage. It's correct to say Greg gave me his notebook and not Greg gave I his notebook. I is the wrong case. So form indicates use. If we see a word like logos, it ends in the sigma, and we're going to study the case endings in this lesson and in future lessons. So that would tell us it's the nominative. It's probably functioning like the subject in a sentence because it ends in a sigma. If we saw the word logon, we'd say, well, that's accusative because it ends in the nu. The nu is the accusative case ending. Logo. Well, that has a iota subscript. We know it's from the word logos, and it's probably functioning like the indirect object because it has the iota subscript. So it's the case ending that indicates the use, the form that indicates the use. Or logu, we would say, okay, this must be genitive because it ends in an upsilon. So what we're saying is that these noun endings that we're going to be studying are very important in understanding how a word functions. There are 24 total endings, and we're going to want to memorize all of them. We have the masculine column. There are 8 because there's both the 4 cases, and there's 2 numbers, singular and plural. There can also be feminine endings, and then neuter endings. Now a quick word about the gender. Just because a word is masculine, feminine, or neuter doesn't mean that somehow the Greeks conceptualized of that thing as either being masculine, feminine, or neuter. No, they just end in certain vowels, and this is known as grammatical gender. It doesn't have to do with whether or not the concept had gender or it was masculine or feminine. It's just how the word forms. And that also has to do with the numbers above. You can see there's 2, 1, 2 written above the columns. Those are declension numbers. First declension are nouns that end in alpha or eta, and they're feminine. And second declension are nouns, masculine or neuter, that end in omicron. Their stem vowel ends in omicron. And that's all that the numbers refer to. Declension has to do with how words form and how they end, how their stem ends. Well, in any case, these are the 24 endings. We can see that there's some overlap. For instance, in the genitive singular and dative singular rows, you can see that the masculine and neuter have the same ending. In the accusative singular, all of the words will end in nu. In the nominative plural, both the masculine and feminine will end in iota. We might ask ourselves, how will we know the difference? It'll partly have to do with how we memorize a word in its lexical form, because the lexical form, the ending, shows us the gender. But another thing will be the stem vowel. For instance, a masculine word will have its stem vowel omicron, whereas a feminine word will have its stem vowel alpha or eta, and that will help us distinguish between the gender when we're parsing them out. There's more overlap. If you look at the genitive plural, the whole row ends in own. The dative plural, iota sigma, iota sigma, iota sigma. So there's a lot of this kind of overlap in this chart. We want to become very familiar with this chart. It'll be impossible to parse words and translate them correctly unless we have this memorized. We start with memorization, and the more and more we see words, the more natural it will become to translate them. When the endings are attached to the stem vowel, they look like this. Os, u, o, on, oi, on, ois, us in the masculine column. In the feminine column with the eta, we have a, ace, a, ain, I, on, ice, us. And you might have noticed, well, what happened? The eta shifted to alpha in the plural. Yeah, that happens commonly. Just something to keep in mind. Other feminine words are going to end in alpha in the singular as well. And then they all end in alpha. But other times there will be words that start or end in eta in the singular, and then they switch in the plural and they end in alpha. But the case endings remain the same. And then in the neuter, there's a lot of overlap. We have, with the masculine, that is, there's on, u, o, on, a, on, ois, a. Here's what they look like attached to the actual words. In the masculine column, we would have logos, logu, logu, logon, logoi, logon, logois, logus. As far as interpretation goes, the nominative singular logos would be translated normally as the subject. So logos means word, and if we saw logos written that way in a Greek sentence, it'd probably be functioning as the subject of a sentence. Logu would probably be translated of a word, or it has other descriptive features. But generally we can provide the keyword of if a word is in the genitive case, and then the translation of a word or of the word. Dative singular would be to the word. Sometimes dative really normally indicates a prepositional idea. Sometimes it's to, sometimes it's for, sometimes it's with, sometimes it's in. But when we're just parsing the word itself, we'll include the keyword to. So logo would be to the word. And the iota subscript tells us, okay, it's the case of the indirect object, the dative. The accusative singular is logon. And this would just be translated word, probably functioning like the direct object in a sentence. Nominative plural would be the words, again functioning as the subject in a translation, the words, because it's plural. Logon, of the words. Logois, to or with or in the words. And accusative plural, words, functioning again as the direct object. And the same is true for all of these other forms. The only difference, of course, would be it's a different word. Graphe is scripture, and ergon is work. But the same grammatical principles apply to the translation of each one of these words. So just to practice here, when we parse, we're going to see a Greek word, and we're going to break it down in its categories. If we go back to this chart, we can see the categories. Well, it's going to have gender. The word could either be masculine, feminine, or neuter. And we know its gender based on its stem vowel. If it's omicron, it's either masculine or neuter. And if the stem vowel is eta or alpha, we know it's feminine. Now a question might be, well, how are we going to distinguish then between a word like logos and ergon, because both of them have the same stem vowel, omicron, both are second declension? That's true, but when a word occurs in its lexical form, that's how we memorize it. You can see logos ends in the sigma, ergon ends in the nu, and that's the key that will help us distinguish the genders. The masculine ends with sigma, the neuter ends with nu in its lexical form. So we'll keep that in mind. That'll help us distinguish. But when we analyze or when we parse, we'll give the gender, we'll give the case, whether it's nominative, genitive, dative, or accusative, and we'll also give whether it's singular or plural. So logo here has the iota subscript. It's from a word we just saw, logos. That's a masculine word. So we already know that it's masculine and dative. And if we look back here at the chart, okay, the iota subscript, we know that's dative, but in the plural it doesn't subscript, so it's got to be singular. So we've already got the majority of the parsing categories. We know that it's dative, singular, masculine, and it'll help us always put the lexical form of each word when we're parsing. We'll put logos. So the translation would be to the word. If we see a word like graphas, we should be thinking to ourselves, okay, this comes from graphe. We can see that the stem vowel is alpha, which is a sign of the plural for a word like graphe, and sigma is the accusative plural case ending. So we would parse graphas, accusative, plural, and it is feminine. The stem vowel is alpha, which is a feminine feature, and the lexical form is graphe. And the translation would be the scriptures, again functioning like a direct object probably in the sentence. Most of you will recognize John 3:16, or at least have it memorized. This is what it looks like in the Greek. Very literally, so for loved God the world, that the Son, the only begotten Son, that is, He gave. Hutos is so, and gar is for, agapesin is the word for loved, ha theos, literally the God. The Greeks used the article in more varying ways than we generally do in English. This just ha theos, the God, refers to the one and only God, God. And ton cosmon, the world. Down in the second line, that the only begotten Son He gave. This would be an example of a very wooden translation. Obviously, it makes for poor English. When we do translation, it is a science and also an art, and it should be based in a good understanding of the grammar of the receptor language. So our task in translating is arranging this in a way that's faithful to the original text, but also something that makes good grammatical sense in the receptor language. Translating is a challenge. It's fun and a blessing, but it's both a science and an art. In any case, for God so loved the world, isn't it interesting that the word that appears really early in the sentence is the word loved? And that's because we can get that sense when we think of it in English, for God so loved the world. But the subject here in Greek actually comes after the verb, and that's because this is emphasizing the fact that God really loves the world, and that to the extent that the only begotten Son He gave. The first part starts out with the verb loved, emphasizing the fact that God loves the world. And the second line, the Son occurs first in that expression because this is the great extent to which God loved the world that He gave His very only begotten Son. The word order of John 3:16 reminds us that Greek is a little more flexible in the way it can describe things, and that's because it's not so much the word order that like what happens in English that determines the function of a word. It's more so the case endings. Now the word order is important, but the Greek, because of the way the case endings function, has the ability to emphasize certain concepts and put them where they want them in the sentence to emphasize them, because the case endings carry the load of showing us the function of the word.